U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is meeting his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov today in Saudi Arabia. Talks are aimed at setting up negotiations for a peace plan for Ukraine without Kyiv or its European allies at the table. It's the first high-level meeting between the two countries since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of its neighbor 3 years ago. A day earlier, European leaders held an emergency summit in Paris over the prospect of being excluded from peace talks. Let's take a look at what the meeting between the U.S. and Russia is likely to accomplish in Riyadh.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in the Saudi capital Riyadh, ahead of talks with his Russian counterpart. For Ukraine, the stakes couldn't be higher, but Ukraine won't be part of the talks. Events have moved fast in the past week. U.S. President Donald Trump spoke to Russian President Vladimir Putin after years in which the U.S. froze Putin out for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. made announcements ahead of negotiations that haven't even been scheduled yet about what a Ukraine peace deal might look like. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has said that NATO membership for Ukraine is unrealistic, as is a return to Ukraine's old borders, in line with key demands from Moscow. He's also said that European and non-European forces should provide security guarantees, but that there would be no U.S. boots on the ground. The Trump administration has also indicated that sanctions relief for Russia is on the table. NATO allies of the U.S. have scrambled to catch up, asserting that they too should take part in any peace talks. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has said British troops could be part of a peacekeeping force. And Sweden says it would not rule out also sending troops to guarantee a ceasefire. Leaders have also discussed a peace plan provision that would see Ukraine gain instant NATO membership if Russia breaks a ceasefire. In all this, Ukraine and its President Volodymyr Zelensky have largely been sidelined. But Zelensky has said Ukraine would not abide by agreements made without its participation. Trump did send his Treasury Secretary to Ukraine to discuss U.S. access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals, suggesting that could be a way to pay back the U.S. for military support. Meanwhile, the war rages on, the front line barely moving, as Ukraine tries to hold on to its territory, knowing that if Russia takes it, Ukraine may not get it back.
And we can now speak to Georg Löffelmann, who's a lecturer in US foreign policy at Queen Mary University in London. Welcome to DW. Thank you so much for your time. So as we've been saying, US and Russia, they're talking again after several years of silence. Can you tell us, are these talks about more than simply resolving the conflict in Ukraine? Is it more about the US and Russia essentially positioning themselves as, these two global power brokers?
Yeah, I think that is exactly it. What we're having here is preliminary talks between the United States and Russia, establishing negotiating positions. And this is not just about the Russo-Ukrainian war. I think the larger picture that emerges here is that this is about the normalization of relations between the United States and Russia. There's already talk about a return of American energy companies to Russia, lifting of economic sanctions. But of course, all of that hinges on ending the war in Ukraine. And what we have seen recently from statements by Pete Hegseth, the speech by Vance, the phone conversation by Trump with Putin, the United States seems ready to make substantial concessions here toward Russia.
So what is at stake here for the US and why the US seems so determined to push for negotiations when the conflict in Ukraine is still raging? Does that relate to what you just said? Essentially, it's about money and normalizing relations.
Yeah, I think what we've also seen here with the Munich Security Conference is a transformation, frankly, of the European security landscape. The United States wants to strategically reduce its footprint in Europe. They want to put responsibility for European security onto the Europeans. And all of that, of course, has caught the Europeans quite on the wrong footing. We're seeing quite panicked diplomatic reactions here. And I think the larger picture here emerges is that we are moving into a world of great power diplomacy, less shared values and alliances and partnerships, how U.S. foreign policy has normally been conducted.
Mm-hmm. If we could go back, though, to the talks about the conflict in Ukraine, Ukraine's President Zelensky has been very clear. He said he will never accept any decisions between the US and Russia without Ukraine's participation in talks. So can these talks be taken seriously as peace talks without Ukraine at the table?
I don't think they can be taken serious as really diplomatic solutions for this conflict. There will also have to be bilateral discussions between Russia and Ukraine, of course. But the problem is that Ukraine is so dependent militarily, financially on the United States that where the United States completely remove their support for Ukraine, it would be very difficult for Ukraine to sustain the war on their own or just with European support. This gives the US a lot of leverage.
Mm-hmm. You talked earlier about this shift in transatlantic relations. Can you talk to us more about the implications for Europe, for US-European relations, given that Europe has been sidelined here?
Yeah, I think this is, quite a worrying sign that Europeans are literally not at the table. I think this also shows what kind of recognition Europe has with the Trump administration. I mean, J.D. Vance recently with his speech almost presented Europe as an ideological enemy for supposedly cracking down on freedom, cracking down on the freedom of speech in Europe. And we are seeing the United States positioning itself, at least partially, even as a rival to Europe. But then we also have voices like Kellogg, for example, which are more conciliatory. So we also have a very confusing picture of what does the Trump administration actually really want? How far are they willing to go to meet the Russians, to withdraw from Europe? So a lot is simply not known. But I think we are potentially gearing up for a summit between Putin and Trump on both the issue of European security and NATO and the Russo-Ukrainian war.
Georg Löffelmann from Queen Mary University in London. Georg, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is meeting his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, today in Saudi Arabia. Talks are aimed at setting up negotiations for a peace plan for Ukraine without Kyiv or Europe at the table. It is the first high-level meeting between the US and Russia since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. The meeting in Riyadh marks an abrupt reversal of years of US efforts to isolate Russia internationally. Joining me now for more on this is DW's Riga Bureau Chief Yuri Reshetto. Yuri and his team report from Riga because DW was banned from reporting in Russia. So, Yuri, these talks, they mark a very sudden end to Russia's international isolation. How much of a diplomatic coup is this seen as in Moscow?
Well, indeed, Anya, Putin is dominating the headlines at the moment. And yes, the most important headline is Russia, Kremlin, Putin himself are out of isolation. The Russian media are celebrating today's negotiations and are happy to use them as, let's say, an opportunity to criticize the West at the same time. Also, they paid close attention to every detail as peace in Ukraine dependent on it. For example, the ties of the participants were compared and analyzed. The state media agency RIA Novosti emphasized that Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and US Secretary of State Rubio are wearing ties of the same color. Of course, these are absolute secondary issues, but you can see that the Russian media are eager to show as many points of common ground with Americans as possible and to say, hey, look here, we understand each other.
So who from Russia is there, apart from the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov? Who's taking part in these talks?
Yeah, Russia is represented at the talk by Lavrov. You said it, President Putin's foreign policy aide Yuri Ushakov and the head of the Russian direct investment fund, Kirill Dmitriev. He already met with the American delegation yesterday. Today, both sides are to discuss not only preparations for the presidential talks, but also the ways to improve US-Russian relations. The Russian delegation handed to the Americans its trade and economic proposals and provided data on the damage, they said, that according to the Russian side, American companies have suffered as a result of the sanctions imposed on Russia.
OK. Vladimir Putin's spokesman says that he is ready to negotiate with the Ukrainian president
on
if,
Russia,
and I quote, if
Vladimir
necessary.
Putin's spokesman says that he is ready to negotiate with the Ukrainian president if, and I quote, if necessary. What does that mean, do you think? Well, I think he said this after his counterpart, Zelensky, Ukrainian president, had said that he would only negotiate with one Russian person with Russian with Putin personally. The two have criticized each other extremely harshly. Zelensky compared Putin to Hitler. Putin spoke on drug-addicted state leadership in Ukraine and question Zin's legitimacy. Putin also said that he could negotiate with him with Zelensky, but he doesn't accept Zelensky's signature under the agreement because he supposedly no longer legitimate, but both men want progress and both are politicians, and politics means making compromises, and Russia is now also saying that Ukraine has the right to join the European Union if it wants to. That seems like quite a significant concession by Russia. It seems indeed, or it sounds like a significant concession, because the Russians are now in a much better negotiation position than 3 years ago. But in fact, Russia has never wanted to undermine Ukraine's EU membership. Of course, Moscow is not thrilled about this, or this development, and the Maidan revolution in 2014 had its origins in Ukraine's desire to get closer to the EU, and not to Russia. But a much more important point for the Russians is Ukraine's NATO membership, and in my opinion, Putin would never say yes to that. DW's Yuri Reto. Many thanks, Yuri.